Hello again. I just want to go over data dictionaries very quickly. So you can read more about this in Appendix 4 of the course spec. You should mainly be familiar with this stuff, but remember, data dictionary is just another technique we use when we are designing a database. So before we actually implement it, we've got the ER diagrams and EO diagrams to help us plan the relationships between the entities, and then at a slightly finer level, more detailed level, we then look at each entity and we look at all the attributes, all the fields we're going to have in them, and we basically write down all the details of these. And remember, just have a think. Imagine you're going to give your design to a different person who's going to actually implement it. They need to get enough information from your design, and so the data dictionary gives them quite detailed information, and that would be really what you're handing over to someone who's actually going to implement it. Okay, so there's nothing too new here, but for each entity in our database, we are going to include the names of all the attributes, all the fields. For each one, we indicate whether they're a primary key or a foreign key, or, and this catches people out a lot, if they're both. So if it's the sort of thing that would be underlined and asterisked, then you write P key and you write F key. Okay, you have to write them both. Or of course, if it's neither, you just leave that blank. The type, the data type. So at higher in Nat5, you write text, number, boolean, etc. Well, at advanced higher, we write these data types. These are SQL data types, and these are the ones you're going to have to write. Okay, it's now once you actually get into creating databases using SQL, you'll get a bit more used to these data types. They might you might find you have to refer back to your notes quite often initially, but instead of text, we write varchar. That's as in it can have a variable number of characters in it. Okay, I think it's up to 255. So varchar is what you write where it's to have text. Int, as in integer for whole numbers. Float, as in floating point for real numbers. And date or time. Okay, so slightly different data types from what you're used to. But again, every field you list the data type. Size. So in SQL, when you create a database, if the field you're creating is varchar, then you have to also indicate what the maximum number of characters it's going to have to store are. Now, the reason we don't just set it to the maximum all the time is because we want to save space. We want to be efficient, so we don't just stick it at 255 every time, because what if we only need to include a few characters, and what if our database has 1 million records in it? Perfectly feasible. Then we're wasting a lot of storage space, setting aside that space for every record. So we work out what we think the maximum size is. So if you've got sample data, then you have a look at that and you literally count up the number of characters in the longest piece of sample data. If you think there's a bit more to it than that, then you can set the size a bit higher. But generally, if you've been given a decent amount of sample data, that's a good starting point. There's not always a right and wrong answer there, but typically in an exam there'll be a range, an acceptable range for the size. Not so small that it can't store the biggest piece of data, but not so big that it's ridiculous that you're using excessive storage. Okay. Required. So you just put a Y or an N, a yes or a no, for each field. So if it's a primary key, then yes, obviously it's required. Generally, if you're unsure, just say it's required. Okay. And required column, obviously that's actually used to indicate whether we should put a presence check on, so a presence check validation. The other validation types we can put on, so range check, length check, restricted choice. Remember all of those, you don't just write that, you write what the details are. Again, imagine you're handing it over to someone else. You can't just write range check, you have to write what the acceptable range is. You can't just write restricted choice, what are the choices? We write lookup if it's a foreign key, so any any attribute that's got a foreign key in it, we look that up. I mean, it's just a type of restricted choice, so looking it up from the values from the other table, the table in which it's a primary key. We are now introducing auto increment as a validation type. So that means we basically use that for surrogate keys. Set them to auto increment. That means each time you add a new record, it just increases the number by 1. So they've all got a unique value. And of course, if there's no suitable validation check, then you leave it as blank. Okay, so you've got some notes on that. There's an appendix in the course spec, and there are a few tasks for you to do. Have fun.